So we're going to take a look at this second part of the Freedom from Britain unit. We're going to take a look at communism, and this is ultimately going to end up leading us into the Cold War. A lot of the essential questions will focus around Korea and China, but that first essential question and the second essential question go through a little bit of the outline of communism, but also can relate to some of the stuff with Latin America that we're going to talk about. So the first thing is we need to define communism. I really like this meme because I think this gives you a great example of it, even if it is supposed to be funny. You have two cows. The state takes both and gives you some milk. Now, if you look on Schoology and you see a similar meme about your cows, you can kind of compare it to different forms of government. I think in socialism, it's again, you have two cows, but it's a little different. I think it's you have two cows and you give one to your neighbor, which is different than the state taking both and giving you some milk. So make sure that you double check those memes so you can kind of compare communism and a couple other forms of religion or forms of government. But in general, in communism, it's all about being equal. In theory. Now, it's really tough to enforce that in a nation, but for the most part, the government is in charge of redistributing goods and of making goods and making sure that everybody gets the same amount. Whether it's money, whether it's goods, the idea is that everybody is equal. And some countries have been able to pull that off and some have not. So for example, Cuba, the salary of a garbage man, a ditch digger, a restaurant worker, and a doctor are all the same. And that's because China enforces that version of communism where everybody makes the same amount of money, everybody is equal. So you need to kind of take a look at whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. When we take a look at China, a lot of people were used to owning their land and having the sale of what they grow on their land, whether that's herds of cattle, whether that's animals, or whether that's food. They were used to that income. But when the state takes over, the state controls all the land. They own all the farms, not the individual person. There's no private ownership in communism. Now they're in charge of making sure that you work the land and that everybody gets a piece of the harvest, but you are not in charge of owning that land. So there's pros and cons, and every nation throughout history, even in current day, has a little different version of communism to make sure that it works for them. But when we take a look at how China became communist. Some of this is going to sound familiar because a lot of this happened in the interwars unit. A lot of this started during that time period. So we looked at the emperor, how he gave up control. It was kind of this warring warlords period. Nobody was strong enough to unite China under one flag. And then the civil war between the communists and the nationalists and the Long March. You guys know all this. But in the end, in 1949, China does become one unified communist country. And right away, the first thing that Mao tackled was the economy. He redistributed the land, which meant he gave it from the landowners to these communal farms where the community was responsible for working on those farms, and the government was in charge of overseeing the harvest. They had this punishment called re-education for the intellectuals, for the students, for the quote unquote professionals that, spoke out of turn. They were sent to work in the farms, in these communal farms, hard labor essentially, as punishment, that they would learn what China is really about. So that was one of the first things. He also eventually adopted the 5-year plans. That was an idea that he borrowed from the Soviet Union, actually. The deal is that for 5 years, the government is going to focus on their list of goals. And the Soviet Union was able to industrialize that way. It was definitely not without suffering. I think it was something like 30 million people died from starvation in the Soviet Union. Something kind of similar happened in China, but China was also successful at getting their industry and infrastructure going. They had to do that at selling their food for really, really cheap so they could buy some of that stuff for the industry. But at the same time, they were able to use that 5-year plans to kind of jumpstart their economy. And it works so well that they still have 5-year plans today. I think they're on like their 12th or 13th 5-year plan today. But it was more than just a government and an economy. Mao's communism was really a part of society and a part of culture. In the 60s, the mid 60s, Mao was afraid that the revolution was running out of steam, mostly because the youth, the teenagers and the young adults growing up, had either seen the very end of the revolution or had not seen the revolution at all when China became communist. And so the idea of the Cultural Revolution was really aimed at strengthening the popularity of Mao and the popularity of the Communist Party during that time period. So you can see in this picture, you can see Mao is in the background, he's the sun, and then all of these scenes surrounding him are all from the Civil War. So this is kind of saying, how great Mao is. And you can see this guy is holding a little red book. At least that was his nickname, Little Red Book. It's actually called Quotations from Chairman Mao. And that was a big, big, big agenda for the Communist Party during the Cultural Revolution. Everybody had to have a little red book. And not just have it, but know what was in it, be able to quote from it, be able to talk about it and agree with it, because that was a sign of whether you were loyal to Mao and the Communist Party or not. If you didn't agree with it, you kept it to yourself. Because if somebody turned you in, or if you were, if you were caught not knowing it or not agreeing with it, you were never seen or heard from again. If you were lucky, you were just sent to the re-education camps. But if you weren't, you were never seen or heard from again. But that little red book was really aimed at teaching that youth, that young adult population, how to be a communist. So that was really a big deal. It's actually kind of funny. I actually have one, not because I'm a communist, but because my husband and I found this in an antique mall. So it's literally this big. Now this is the translated English version, but this is, you can see there's a picture of Mao in there. But this is, what you would carry on you and what you were expected to be able to talk about. So that's a cool piece of history that I have. But these were some quotes that you would find in the Little Red Book. Every communist must grasp the truth. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Now, even though that might be a little bit of a metaphor, that was like blunt truth. Political power goes to the strongest. And if you want political power, you have to be able to be strong. And that was something that Mao definitely tried to do up until his dying days. He was fighting to stay in power and fighting to stay top dog. The other one, all reactionaries are paper tigers. In appearance, they are terrifying, but in reality, they are not so powerful. It's a really good metaphor, too, for paper tigers. So you're going to come across the Little Red Book in one of the readings, one of the links for your study guide. But this is a little background on what it's like to live in China under that very early version of communism.